The buzz of the phone on the granite countertop was obscene in the morning silence. It was 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because the digital clock on the oven was blinking it at me. Each flash a tiny silent scream. For 40 years, my mornings had begun with the scent of brewing coffee and the soft rustle of Richard reading the Wall Street Journal. Now there was just the sterile quiet of an empty house and a single vibrating notification. I didn't have to look to know who it was from. In the last few months, he had become the only person who texted me with such jarring urgency. I let it buzz a second time, a final insistent tremor against the cold stone, before I picked it up. The screen illuminated a message that was as brief as it was brutal. 5 words to erase 4 decades. It's done. Starting my new life. There was no salutation, no dear Juliana. There wasn't even an apology. Just a statement of fact, as transactional as a grocery receipt. The final sentence was an order. A digital door slammed in my face. Don't contact me. My hands didn't shake. I felt a strange icy calm spread through my veins, a kind of emotional permafrost. It was the body's last defense, I suppose, when the mind couldn't process the sheer scale of the wreckage. I had known this was coming. I had felt it in the growing distance between us, in the way he started looking through me instead of at me, in the scent of a perfume that wasn't mine clinging to his suits. But knowing the storm is coming and standing in the eye of it are two vastly different things. This was the eye. And in its dead calm, I could see everything with a terrifying clarity. My gaze drifted from the phone to my tablet, which lay on the kitchen island, still open to our joint savings account page from the night before. I had been balancing our portfolio, a ritual I had performed weekly for decades, a habit Richard had long since dismissed as one of my little hobbies. My finger hovered over the refresh icon. It felt like holding a key to a door I knew led to a void, but I had to turn it. I had to see the emptiness for myself. The little wheel spun for a fraction of a second, and then the numbers reloaded. The balance I had looked at just last night, a comfortable and reassuring $1,247,381.52, was gone. In its place was a stark, unforgiving figure, $0. The 2 zeros looked like a pair of hollow eyes, a digital skull staring back at me, mocking the life I thought I had built. $1.2 million. It wasn't just money. It was our first down payment on this very house in Maple Creek, a shoebox of a starter home that we slowly, brick by brick, transformed into a suburban palace. It was the profit from the first apartment building I had convinced him to buy, a risky investment in a transitioning neighborhood that became the cornerstone of his real estate empire. My analysis, his name on the deed. It was the college fund for our 2 children, long since graduated and flown, the money we'd replenished for future grandchildren. It was 40 years of my late nights, my careful calculations, my sacrificed career, all distilled into a number that he had just deleted. He must have been planning this for months. The quiet liquidation of assets, the strategic transfers, all happening just beneath the surface of our life. He had used the very legal structures I had put in place to protect our wealth as a weapon to disarm me. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he was leaving me with nothing but this paid-off house, a gilded cage filled with memories that were now poisoned. He pictured me, I'm sure, collapsing in a heap on the Italian marble floors, a hysterical, abandoned old woman. He probably imagined me weeping, begging, calling a lawyer who would tell me there was nothing I could do. He imagined me broken. He was so wrong. I placed the tablet back on the counter, the $0 balance glowing like an epitaph. I walked to the pantry, my steps even, my back straight. I took out my favorite canister of Earl Grey tea, spooned the loose leaves into my porcelain pot, and poured the boiling water. The aroma filled the kitchen, a small, civilized ritual in the midst of unspeakable savagery. I watched the steam curl into the air, each wisp a ghost of the life that had just vanished. He thought he knew me. After 40 years of sharing a bed, a home and a life, he thought he knew the woman he had married. But he had forgotten who Juliana Petrov was before she became Juliana Hayes. He had forgotten the analyst, the strategist, the woman who saw the world not as a home, but as a balance sheet of assets and liabilities. And he had just made himself a very significant liability. As I poured the steep tea into my cup, my other phone, A simple, untraceable burner phone I kept in the pocket of my house robe began to ring. It didn't buzz. It chimed a single clear musical note. Picked it up. The screen displayed a single saved contact. The architect. I took a sip of my tea first. It was hot, and the bergamot was fragrant. I let the warmth slide down my throat, a small anchor in the storm. Then I answered, my voice as smooth and steady as the surface of a frozen lake. There was no tremor, no hint of the chaos that had been unleashed just minutes before. Phase 1 is complete, I said, my tone low and conversational, as if I were discussing the weather. A young man's voice came back, crisp and professional, devoid of any emotion other than focused efficiency. Confirmation received, Juliana. Was it a clean sweep? He took the bait, I replied, looking at the tablet on the counter. The $0 was still there. A monument to Richard's greed and my patience. Every last dollar. The transfer was initiated from his personal laptop at 8:58 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It cleared moments ago. There was a soft clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line, the sound of quiet competence. I see it, the architect said. The funds are through the first firewall. They're tumbling through the blockchain now. Untraceable. By the time he realizes the destination account is a ghost, the money will be safely nested in our holding wallet. Excellent, I said, taking another sip of tea. I walked over to the large bay window that overlooked our backyard. The lawn was perfectly manicured. A lush green carpet that Richard had always been so proud of. He wouldn't be mowing it this weekend. He would never mow it again. The funds are secure, Juliana, the architect's voice continued, pulling me back from the view. I am now commencing phase 2. The Odyssey Capital website goes live in 54321. We are officially in business. Good, I said softly. Let the games begin. I hung up, placing the burner phone back into my pocket. The silence of the house returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the oppressive silence of abandonment. It was the charged, humming silence of a chessboard after the opening move. Richard thought he had delivered the checkmate. He didn't realize he had just moved his king into my perfectly laid trap. He had left me in an empty house, but he had forgotten that I was the one who had drawn the blueprints. And now I was going to burn his new life to the ground with the fortune he thought he had stolen before I was Mrs. Richard Hayes. A name that felt like a well-worn, comfortable coat that no longer fit. I was Juliana Petrov. That name Petrov had weight. It had edges. It belonged to a woman who saw the world not in shades of gray, but in the stark, beautiful clarity of numbers on a balance sheet. At 26, I was a senior financial analyst at a firm in downtown Chicago, and my colleagues had a nickname for me. The Scalpel. I could dissect a company's financial report in under an hour, find the hidden debts, the inflated assets, the single thread of a lie that could unravel a whole fraudulent tapestry. Numbers don't lie. They tell a story more honest than any person ever could, and I was fluent in their language. It was a power, a quiet, thrilling confidence that came from knowing the absolute truth of a situation. I gave it all up. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a slow, sweet erosion, the way a river smooths a stone. I gave it up for love. I met Richard at a charity gala my firm was sponsoring. He wasn't like the other men in suits, all sharp angles and calculated smiles. He had a dreamer's eyes and a laugh that seemed to fill the entire room. He spoke of building things, not just portfolios. He talked about homes, communities, legacies. He had the vision, I had the roadmap. In the beginning, we were a perfect equation. He'd bring me a potential real estate deal, sketched on a cocktail napkin, full of passion and potential. I'd take it home and by dawn I'd have a full projection. Cash flow analysis, risk assessment, a 10-year profit and loss forecast. I was the silent engine in his shiny, ever-expanding convertible. He was the one driving, waving to the crowds, but I was the one ensuring we never ran out of gas, never took a wrong turn, never drove off a cliff. Our first home was a tiny apartment above a bakery. We'd work late into the night at our small dining table. The smell of fresh bread rising through the floorboards, blueprints and spreadsheets spread out between us. He'd trace the lines of a future building with his finger, and I'd trace the flow of capital that would make it a reality. I identified the undervalued commercial properties in emerging neighborhoods. I structured the loans, negotiated with the banks, and created the tax-efficient corporate shells that became the foundation of Hayes Properties. It was my mind, the mind of Juliana Petrov, that saw the path from $1,000 investment to $1 million asset. And I did it all without a title, without a salary, without a single share in my name. Because I was Mrs. Richard Hayes. My reward was supposed to be our life together. Our shared success. That was the contract I had signed in my heart. A contract built on trust, a variable I had tragically miscalculated. He just forgot. He forgot who built the engine. He forgot that the quiet woman who organized his charity dinners was the same woman who had once made seasoned executives tremble with a single, pointed question about their quarterly earnings. To enjoy the fruits of that labor, we moved to Maple Creek, Colorado. It was the kind of town you see in magazines, a postcard of American prosperity. Manicured lawns, gleaming SUVs in every driveway, and neighborhood potlucks where the smiles were as bright and empty as the crystal wine glasses. It was a town of perfect facades, and we, Richard and Juliana Hayes, were its golden couple. He was the charismatic, self-made real estate mogul. I was his elegant, devoted wife, the quiet pillar of support who hosted the best garden parties. We lived a life that was meticulously curated, a stage play for an audience of neighbors and so-called friends. But behind the closed doors of our sprawling mortgage-free home, a home I had strategically paid off in 7 years instead of 30, the script began to change. It started subtly, a slight shift in his tone. We'd be at a dinner party, and someone would ask a question about the market. I'd begin to offer an analysis, my old instincts kicking in, and Richard would cut me off with a patronizing laugh. "Oh, darling," he'd say, placing a heavy hand on my arm. "Let's not bore our friends with the technical stuff." The first time I thought he was being considerate. The fifth time I knew he was building a cage. The cuts grew deeper. He started making financial decisions without consulting me. A risky commercial venture I would have flagged in a heartbeat. A speculative stock purchase that was pure emotion, no logic. When I'd bring out the numbers, my carefully prepared charts showing the potential downsides, he'd wave a dismissive hand. "Juliana, things are more complicated now. The market has changed since your day." My day. As if my mind had an expiration date. Then came the phrase that he wielded like a weapon. "Your mind is slowing down a bit, honey." He'd say it with such false concern, a gentle, loving poison. He said it when I questioned why he was moving large sums of money between accounts. He said it when I asked about a new credit card with a ridiculously high limit that I'd found in his desk. He used my age, my 65 years, as a smokescreen for his deceit. It was the most brilliant, cruel strategy. How do you fight an accusation that's wrapped in the language of care? To our friends, to our children, he was just a concerned husband, looking out for his aging wife who was getting a little forgetful. He was creating a narrative brick by painful brick that I was no longer competent. He was painting me as a relic. And I, the woman who had built the very fortress he lived in, was being systematically locked out of every room. The final blow came not with a bang, but with a quiet click of a mouse. One Tuesday morning I tried to log into our main investment portfolio, an account I had set up and managed for 30 years. Access denied. I tried again. Access denied. My password, the name of our first dog, a secret between us, had been changed. My name had been removed as an administrator. I was no longer a partner. I was a dependent, a guest in the empire I had built. I sat there staring at the screen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the cavernous, silent house. He hadn't just forgotten who I was. He was actively, deliberately trying to erase me. The first sign wasn't a slammed door or a raised voice. It was a piece of paper thick and cream-colored, resting on the marble island in our kitchen. The Cartier stationery felt heavier than it should, as if weighted by the lie it contained. It was an invoice, a receipt for a single transaction, a $20,000 charge for the Agraffe diamond necklace. My heart didn't pound. It didn't stutter. It simply went quiet, a deep cellular stillness settling over me. It wasn't my anniversary. That had passed 2 months ago, marked by a polite dinner at a restaurant he chose and a cashmere scarf that felt more like an obligation than a gift. My birthday wasn't for another 6 months. I ran my finger over the embossed logo. $20,000. For 40 years, every expenditure over $500 was a conversation. A new furnace, a trip to see our grandchildren, even the car I drove. They were all joint decisions, columns in a spreadsheet I meticulously maintained. This was not a column in a spreadsheet. This was a secret. For a few days, I let the silence be my laboratory. I watched him. I observed him the way a scientist observes a specimen, detached and clinical. He was different. There was a lightness to his step I hadn't seen in years, a youthful energy that sat awkwardly on his 65-year-old frame. He started humming, a habit he'd lost sometime during the last recession. He'd look at his phone and a small private smile would touch his lips. It was a smile I didn't recognize, one that was never meant for me. I'd ask him what was so amusing, and he'd just shake his head, the smile vanishing. Just a funny email from the office, Julie. You wouldn't get it. The dismissal was as casual as breathing. You wouldn't get it. He had been saying variations of that for a decade, slowly, methodically, walling off parts of our life, parts of my life that I had built, until I was left on the outside of my own home. The confirmation came, as so many things do now, through the cold, blue light of a screen. It took me a week of quiet, late-night searching. I didn't know what I was looking for, just a name, a face, anything to give shape to the $20,000 ghost in our marriage. I found her on Instagram. Chloe Summers. 28 years old. A wellness influencer. Her page was a curated fantasy of green juices, yoga poses in exotic locations, and vapid captions about living your truth. And there, in a photo posted a week prior, was the necklace. It lay against her tanned, youthful skin, the diamonds winking in the filtered sunlight of a beach I didn't recognize. She was smiling, that same private smile I had seen on my husband's face. And she had tagged him. Richard Hayes. The caption read, "Feeling so blessed and grateful for the people who see and support my journey." And then the hashtag that felt like a punch to the solar plexus. Best benefactor ever. I scrolled through the comments. A flood of heart emojis and fire symbols. OMG girl, you deserve it. He's a keeper. Get it, Chloe. I put the phone down on the cold sheets next to me. The space where Richard should have been was empty. He was in the guest room again, claiming he had an early conference call and didn't want to wake me. I felt nothing. It was a strange, hollow sensation. The shock and the hurt had been metabolized so quickly they bypassed my heart entirely, leaving behind only an unnerving, crystalline clarity. This wasn't a midlife crisis. This wasn't a mistake. This was a transaction. He had purchased a new life, and the necklace was just the down payment. My mind, the part of me he had forgotten existed, the part that saw the world in patterns and numbers and consequences, began to stir from a long, deep sleep. A few weeks later, he brought the new life into our home. Not her, not yet, but her ideas. He sat me down at the breakfast table, his hands clasped together with a kind of feverish excitement I hadn't seen since he closed his first big real estate deal 30 years ago. A deal I had structured, a deal for which I had run every last number. "Julie," he began, his voice booming with false magnanimity, "I'm about to get in on the ground floor of something revolutionary. Something that's going to change everything." He spoke of an app. A wellness app called Elysian. He used words like synergy and paradigm shift and disruptor. They were empty, meaningless words, but he said them with the conviction of a true believer. It was, he explained, Chloe's brainchild. An app that would curate personalized wellness journeys for a subscription fee. He was going to be the primary investor. He wanted to pour a significant amount of our capital into it. I listened. I nodded. I didn't let the cold fury that was coiling in my stomach show on my face. That night, after he was asleep in the guest room, I went to my study. The room was my sanctuary, the one place that was still truly mine. He never came in here. He called it my hobby room, as if the complex financial modeling and market analysis I did for our portfolio were equivalent to knitting. I found the business plan he'd printed out and left on the counter. It was glossy, full of stock photos of smiling, beautiful people. But the numbers were a joke. A fantasy. I stayed up until 3 in the morning running my own projections. The user acquisition cost was astronomical. The churn rate, based on similar apps, would be brutal. The burn rate for their proposed marketing budget could incinerate the GDP of a small nation. There was no viable path to profitability. It wasn't an investment, it was a vanity project. A very, very expensive gift for his new muse. The next morning I tried to show him. I laid out my spreadsheets next to his glossy business plan. I kept my voice even clinical. Richard, look at the cash flow projections. They haven't accounted for server costs scaling with their user base. And their customer lifetime value is wildly optimistic. This isn't a business, it's a bonfire for our money. I pointed to a specific cell. Look here. This alone is a fatal flaw. He didn't even look at the spreadsheet. He looked at me. His eyes filled with a weary condescension that was more insulting than any shout. He reached over and patted my hand, a gesture one might use on a frightened child or a senile old woman. Don't worry your pretty little head, Julie, he said, the words dripping with patronizing affection. This is the big leagues. It's about vision, not just bean counting. You wouldn't understand. He pushed my spreadsheets aside, slid his own ridiculous plan into his briefcase and stood up. I'm meeting Chloe and her team today to finalize the wire transfer. And just like that it was done. He walked out of the kitchen, leaving me there with the proof of our impending financial ruin. It was then I understood. He wasn't just leaving me. He was erasing me. He was taking the 40 years of my life, my work, my intellect, the very foundation of the wealth I had built for us, and he was converting it into fuel for his new life. He was bankrupting our shared past to finance his future. The cuts were getting deeper, closer to the bone. The final cut, the one that severed the last thread of any past I thought we'd shared, came not as a piece of paper or a condescending remark, but as a whisper through a closed door. It was a Tuesday night. He was in his office, a space that was once our shared library, now his command center. The mahogany door, which I had picked out decades ago, was slightly ajar. I was walking by on my way to bed, and I heard his voice. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. It was soft, intimate, full of a breathless excitement and promise. It was the voice he had used when he proposed to me, the voice he'd used when he told me he was buying our first house, the voice he'd used when our children were born. He was using it now for her. I froze, my hand on the banister. My body went cold, my feet rooted to the floor. I couldn't move. I could only listen. I know, baby. He was whispering, a low conspiratorial murmur. Just a little longer. Once we liquidate the old assets, we're free. Completely free. There was a pause. I could imagine her, on the other end of the line, her voice a soft purr of encouragement. No, she won't be a problem, he continued, and the casual cruelty of his tone was a physical blow. She'll be fine. The house is paid off. What more does she need at her age? She can live out her days quietly, garden a little. She'll be perfectly comfortable. Live out her days quietly. He was painting a picture of my future. A future where I was a dotty old woman, a relic put out to pasture, content with a paid-off house while he and his new lover sailed off into the sunset on the fortune I had built. He was describing my obsolescence. He saw me as a problem to be managed, an asset to be disposed of, a loose end to be tied up. He had already buried me. He just hadn't told me yet. In that moment, standing in the dim hallway of the house I had made a home, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't grief. It wasn't heartbreak. Those emotions felt small, inadequate for the scale of this betrayal. It was the sudden, shocking ignition of a pilot light that had been dormant for decades. The analyst. The strategist. The woman who saw 10 moves ahead on the chessboard. He thought he was talking to his lover. He had no idea I was on the other side of the door. He had no idea he was delivering a monologue to his executioner. He was drafting my quiet, gentle end, and I, in the silent darkness of the hall, was drafting a blueprint for his ruin. I turned without a sound and walked back to my study. I closed the door, sat down at my desk, and opened a new blank file on my computer. The cursor blinked on the screen, a tiny rhythmic heartbeat in the quiet room. The war had begun. He just didn't know he was the enemy. My first call was to a man named Arthur Vance. He'd been our family lawyer for 20 years. A man whose Christmas card photo always featured a golden retriever wearing a festive collar. He was supposed to be a bastion of stability, of reason. His voice on the phone, however, was thin and reedy, stripped of its usual holiday cheer. It was the voice of a man delivering a eulogy. "Juliana, I've reviewed the documents you sent over," he began, a sigh already embedded in his words. "The ones from the 2014 refinancing of the lake house." I sat at the polished mahogany desk in Richard's in my home office. The leather chair felt too large, a throne built for a king who had abdicated. "And?" I asked, my own voice a stranger in the quiet room. "And it's all in order legally speaking. It's a standard durable power of attorney." He said the words as if they were a diagnosis, a terminal one. "Durable power of attorney," I repeated, the syllables tasting like ash. I remembered that day. We were at a different lawyer's office, a sterile place that smelled of paper and weak coffee. Richard had slid a thick stack of documents in front of me. "Just signatures, darling," he'd said, tapping a pen impatiently on the table. "Standard procedure for the new loan. It just lets me handle the paperwork if you're unavailable." I was busy then, managing the contractors for our daughter's home renovation, juggling the grandkids' school schedules. I was a wife, a mother, a grandmother. I was a manager of domestic life, a CEO of the mundane. And I trusted him. I signed where he pointed, my pen gliding over the line without a second thought. A mistake born not of foolishness, but of a love I thought was granite. "What does it mean, Arthur?" "In plain English." He cleared his throat. "It means that, in the eyes of the law, you granted Richard the full authority to act on your behalf in all financial matters. Buying, selling, liquidating its ironclad. He had every legal right to empty that joint savings account. He has the right to sell the properties. He has the right to manage everything." A cold dread, heavier than any grief I'd felt before, settled in my bones. So I fight it. I tell them he misled me. I tell them he was planning this all along. Arthur's sigh was deeper this time, full of a pity that felt like an insult. "Juliana, to fight this, you'd have to file a lawsuit contesting the power of attorney. You'd have to argue that you were not of sound mind when you signed it, or that he exerted undue influence. His lawyers, and believe me, with that kind of money, he'll have the best. They will paint a very specific picture of you." I didn't need him to elaborate, but he did anyway. His words were careful, precise, each one a small, sharp stone. "They will bring up your age, Juliana. They'll talk about how you stepped back from managing the finances years ago. They'll portray you as a confused, perhaps even senile, woman who is now lashing out because her husband has moved on. They'll subpoena friends, neighbors. They'll turn your life into a public spectacle. It would be a long, brutal, and excruciatingly expensive fight. A war of attrition. And frankly, with the documents as they are, your chances of winning are slim." He paused, letting the silence hang. "Even if you did win, it could take years. By then, the money could be gone, funneled through a dozen shell corporations. You'd be left with a moral victory and a mountain of legal bills." I stared out the window at the perfectly manicured lawn, at the oak tree Richard and I had planted when our daughter was born. It was a lie. This whole life, this beautiful, respectable life, was a lie. The law, the very system meant to protect, was the cage he had built around me. He hadn't just taken the money. He had used my own hand, my own trust, to lock the door and throw away the key. "So I have no recourse," I said. It wasn't a question. "From a traditional legal standpoint," Arthur said gently, "your options are severely limited." I closed my eyes. The image of a courtroom flashed in my mind. Richard, looking solemn and concerned on the witness stand, while a sharp-suited lawyer tore my memory and my sanity to shreds. The whispers in the gallery. The humiliating headlines. I would be Juliana Hayes, the scorned, senile wife. No, he would not have that victory. He would not turn my pain into a public circus. The law was his shield. I couldn't break it. I would have to go around it. "Thank you, Arthur," I said, my voice now devoid of any emotion. It was as flat and cold as a surgeon's scalpel. "You've been very clear." I hung up the phone before he could offer any more useless condolences. For a long time I just sat there, the silence of the big empty house pressing in on me. He thought he had won. He thought the law would protect him. But the law is a blunt instrument. It's a shield for bullies and a maze for the righteous. I didn't need a shield. I needed a sword. And I would have to forge it myself. For a moment, just a single terrifying moment, I faltered. The cold resolve that had settled over me after Arthur's call fractured, and a wave of suffocating doubt washed in. I stood up from the desk and walked, as if in a trance, into the living room. The afternoon sun streamed through the bay windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny forgotten memory. My hand, trembling slightly, reached for the thick leather-bound photo album on the coffee table. The cover was worn smooth at the edges from 40 years of turning pages. I opened it to a random page. It was our daughter Sarah's wedding. There was Richard, his face beaming with a pride that seemed so genuine it hurt to look at, walking her down the aisle. His hand was tucked in her arm, his smile broad and unforced. He looked like the perfect father. He looked like my Richard. I traced the outline of his face with my fingertip. The man in this photograph would never forge a signature. The man in this photograph would never leave the mother of his child with nothing. Would he? I turned the page. A photo of our first grandson, little Sam, no older than 5, sitting on Richard's shoulders. They were at the beach, the ocean a brilliant blue behind them, and both of them were laughing, their heads thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. I could almost hear the sound, the deep rumble of Richard's laugh mingling with Sam's high-pitched giggle. This was their grandfather, the man who taught them how to skip stones, who built them elaborate forts out of couch cushions, who read them bedtime stories with silly voices for every character. Could I destroy that man? Could I tear down the image they held of him? The shame of what I was contemplating coiled in my stomach. The plan forming in the dark corners of my mind felt monstrous, alien. This wasn't me. I was Juliana Hayes. I was a wife, a mother, a grandmother. I baked cookies. I gardened. I hosted Thanksgiving. I didn't orchestrate elaborate financial takedowns. I didn't plot the ruin of the man whose children carried my blood. The weight of our shared history of 4 decades of life pressed down on me, and for the first time since I saw that zero balance, I felt tears welling in my eyes. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping my heart. Fear of what I would become. Fear of what I would lose, not just financially but within myself. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, a jarring electronic sound in the quiet, sun-drenched room. I ignored it, but it buzzed again. And again. A notification. Probably just a news alert. But something compelled me to pick it up. My thumb hovered over the screen before swiping it open. It was an Instagram notification. A friend had tagged me in a comment. My finger, moving with a will of its own, tapped on the profile picture of the person who made the original post. Chloe Summers. Her feed was a curated fantasy of expensive meals, tropical locations, and designer clothes. It was a life paid for by my money. I scrolled, a detached, clinical sort of disgust rising in me, and then I saw it. A photo posted just 3 days ago. It was a pool. A stunning infinity-edge pool overlooking a turquoise ocean. I recognized the resort from a travel magazine I'd flipped through months ago. A place in the Maldives. A place I'd mentioned wanting to go for our 40th anniversary. A suggestion Richard had dismissed as extravagant. But it wasn't the location that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the people in the pool. It was Richard, his back to the camera, holding my grandson Sam. He was teaching him how to swim, his hand steady on Sam's small chest. Sam was kicking his feet, splashing water, his face a mixture of fear and excitement. It was an intimate, grandfatherly moment. A moment that belonged in our family album, not on this stranger's public profile. And then I read the caption. 4 little words typed in a breezy, carefree font beneath the image. Practicing for the future. The air left my lungs. The photo album on my lap suddenly felt like a book of fiction. The man in those glossy pages, the doting father, the laughing grandfather, he was a ghost. A character Richard had played for 40 years. The real Richard was here, in this digital image, building a new future with a new family, using my grandson as a prop in his new life. He wasn't just leaving me, he was replacing me. He was practicing to be a grandfather to Chloe's future children, using my own flesh and blood for the rehearsal. He had already destroyed the man in the photographs. He had already made his choice. The shame and fear that had suffocated me moments before evaporated, replaced by something clean and cold and hard as diamond. He had erased our past. Now I had to secure my future. The tears dried on my cheeks. I closed the photo album, the soft thud of the cover echoing the closing of a door in my heart. I picked up my phone. I had to make a call. I needed an architect. I scrolled through my contacts past the names of neighbors and book club members, all the people who knew me as Juliana Hayes, the pleasant, unassuming wife. My finger stopped on a name listed only as Leo. My nephew. My sister's son. A boy the family had written off as a lost cause years ago. A rebellious teenager who cared more for code than for conversation. They saw a problem. I saw brilliance. When his parents disowned him for choosing a computer science degree at MIT over the family's sensible accounting business, I was the one who quietly paid his tuition. All 4 years of it. I never asked for it back. I never mentioned it again. But it was there between us. A debt of loyalty that I knew he would honor. He owed me. I pressed the call button. He picked up on the second ring. Aunt Juliana? His voice was deeper than I remembered, but still had that quick, impatient energy. I could hear the clicking of a keyboard in the background. Leo, I need your help, I said, no preamble. This was not a social call. The clicking stopped. What's wrong? You sound different. Things have changed, I said. I need an expert. Someone who can move through the dark, who can see things others can't. I need someone off the grid. I need an architect. There was a pause on the line, but it wasn't a pause of confusion. It was a pause of understanding. Leo was a prodigy. A ghost in the machine who could build or dismantle entire digital worlds from his apartment in Silicon Valley. He knew exactly what I was asking for. What's the project? He asked, his voice now low and serious. The target is Richard, I said simply. Another pause, this one shorter. Okay, he said, a world of acceptance in that single word. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask if I was sure. He just accepted the mission. Give me everything you have. Bank names, account numbers, online passwords you might know, social media profiles. Everything. I'm going dark. I'll start the initial reconnaissance and see what the digital footprint looks like. Don't call me. I'll call you. The line went dead. I felt a sliver of control return, the first I'd felt in days. I was no longer just a victim. I was a client, and I had just hired the best. The next 72 hours were a study in suspended animation. I moved through my house like a ghost, performing the meaningless rituals of my old life. I watered plants I no longer cared about. I made meals I couldn't eat. I answered calls from concerned friends with a placid, reassuring voice, telling them Richard was on an extended business trip and I was enjoying the quiet. Every lie felt like practice. With each passing hour, the tension in the house grew. A low hum beneath the floorboards. I was waiting for the architect to call with the blueprints. The call came on a Tuesday night. I was staring at the television, not registering the brightly colored images, when my phone lit up with an unknown number. It's me, Leo's voice said, tight with an anger I had never heard from him before. I'm on a secure line. What did you find? I asked, my heart beginning to pound. It's worse than you think, Aunt Juliana. It's so much worse. He took a shaky breath. He wasn't just planning on taking the savings. He was planning to bury you. What are you talking about, Leo? I dug into his encrypted emails, his cloud storage. I found the application documents. 3 weeks ago, Richard applied for a second mortgage on your house. The house that's been paid off for a decade. The room started to spin. A second mortgage? But that's impossible. My name is on the deed. It would require my signature. Leo's voice was venomous. He knows that. Which is why he submitted a digital power of attorney form, the one you told me about, and he forged your electronic signature on the final loan agreement. He was approved 2 weeks ago. The money was disbursed last Thursday, the day before he left. I sank into a chair, the phone feeling slick in my hand. How much? I whispered. $500,000. $500,000. He had not only stolen our shared past, our liquid assets. He had stolen our foundation, the very roof over my head. He planned to leave me not just broke but $500,000 in debt. He wanted to leave me with nothing but ashes and IOUs. The bank would come for the house. I would be homeless. A broke, homeless, elderly woman. That was the future he had designed for me. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a meticulous, calculated act of annihilation. Any lingering flicker of doubt, any ghost of the man I once loved, was instantly and permanently extinguished. My resolve didn't just harden into steel. It became something sharper, something colder. There was no going back. There was no room for mercy. This was no longer about getting my money back. This was about survival. Leo, I said, my voice eerily calm. The project has changed. This isn't a recovery mission anymore. It's a demolition. I was hoping you'd say that, he replied, the anger in his voice now focused, weaponized. Because I've been thinking. We can't just stop him. We can't just sue him. The legal system is too slow, too public. We need to beat him at his own game. The world of high-risk, high-reward investment. His ego is his greatest weakness. We need to use it. A plan began to form, audacious and terrifying in its scope. We wouldn't just try to stop his investment in Chloe's foolish app. We would become the investment. We spent the next 2 hours on that secure line, the architect and his client, laying the foundation for our trap. Leo's mind worked at lightning speed. He proposed building a ghost company from the ground up, a boutique venture capital firm so exclusive, so prestigious, that it would be irresistible to a man like Richard. It needed a name that conveyed power, journey, and mystique. We settled on Odyssey Capital. It sounded established, profound. Leo laid out the strategy. A flawless website, fabricated profiles for a team of investment gurus, and strategically placed articles on financial blogs that he could manipulate to appear legitimate. It would be a digital Potemkin village, a perfect facade designed to lure in one very specific, very greedy man. It's brilliant, I said, the scope of it taking my breath away. He'll see it as a mark of his own genius that such a firm would be interested in him. Exactly, Leo said. But there's a problem. To make it look real, we need a real corporate registration, a bank account, a server infrastructure that's untraceable. We need seed money to build the illusion. And we need it fast. I'm good, but I'm not a magician. I estimate we'll need at least $50,000 in liquid capital to make Odyssey Capital bulletproof. $50,000. The number hung in the air. I looked around the opulent room, at the art on the walls, the antique furniture. Everything was a joint asset, an asset Richard legally controlled. My personal accounts were meager, meant for groceries and gifts for the grandchildren. I had nothing. Richard had made sure of that. Except he hadn't. He had forgotten something. He had forgotten about the woman who came before Juliana Hayes. He had forgotten about my mother, and her mother before her. After the call with Leo, I went upstairs to my bedroom closet. In the very back, tucked away beneath a stack of old cashmere sweaters, was a heavy dark red velvet box. I hadn't opened it in years. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on faded silk, lay my past. My mother's jewelry. A 3-strand pearl necklace she wore on her wedding day. My grandmother's engagement ring. A modest but beautiful Art Deco diamond. A set of sapphire earrings my father had given my mother for their 25th anniversary. Each piece was a story, a tangible link to a life of love and security, a life before Richard. They were the heirlooms I was meant to pass down to Sarah, and she to her daughter. Richard had forgotten they existed. To him they were just old-fashioned trinkets, gathering dust in a closet. He had never understood their value wasn't in the carats or the gold, but in the history they held. The plan required capital, a seed from which our deception could grow, and this was the only capital I had left. The next day, I drove to a part of the city I hadn't visited in decades. The streets were grittier. the buildings closer together. I found the address Leo had sent me, a pawn shop squeezed between a laundromat and a boarded-up storefront. The sign above the door, Honest Abe's Pawn, flickered weakly. The irony was a bitter pill. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and desperation. A bell chimed as I entered. A man with a weary face and a magnifying glass looped around his neck looked up from behind a counter cluttered with other people's forgotten dreams. I didn't say a word. I simply opened the red velvet box and placed it on the glass countertop. He picked up the pearl necklace first, his fingers surprisingly gentle. He weighed it in his palm, examined the clasp through his loop. He did the same with the ring, the earrings. He never looked at my face. It was better that way. He wasn't interested in my story, only in the market value of its artifacts. After several long minutes of silent inspection, he named a price. It was less than the pieces were worth, but more than I had hoped for. It was enough. "Cash," I said, my voice a dry whisper. He counted out the bills, the crisp notes a stark contrast to the faded silk of the jewelry box. As I placed the stacks of money into my handbag, my eyes fell on the empty velvet box on the counter. The indentations where the jewelry used to lie looked like fresh wounds. The burning irony of the moment was almost unbearable. I was selling the most precious pieces of my past, memories of genuine love and family, to finance a future built on a lie. I was sacrificing sentiment for strategy. I was trading my mother's pearls for a pound of flesh. As I walked out of that dingy shop and into the harsh afternoon light, I knew there was no part of the old Juliana left. She had been sold, piece by precious piece, to pay for the war that was to come. The 72 hours that followed my call with Leo were a blur of creation, a storm of digital alchemy conducted in the quiet hum of his basement apartment. The air was thick with the scent of lukewarm coffee and the electric crackle of pure, focused intellect. Time seemed to warp in that subterranean space, losing its normal rhythm, marked not by the sun but by the milestones of our phantom enterprise. I watched, a silent partner to a silent coup, as my nephew, the boy I once helped with his science fair projects, became a god of the virtual world. He didn't just build a company, he breathed life into a myth. Odyssey Capital was born not of steel and glass, but of meticulously crafted code and weaponized psychology. It rose from the ether, a shimmering mirage so convincing it could cast a real shadow. Leo was its architect and I, its silent, avenging muse. The website was his masterpiece. It wasn't just a digital brochure. It was a fortress of credibility. The design was minimalist, exuding the kind of understated, old-money confidence that would make a man like Richard, with his new-money anxieties, salivate. Sleek, charcoal-gray backgrounds, sharp white fonts and slow panning, professionally shot B-roll of abstract cityscapes. Every pixel screamed exclusivity and power. Leo populated it with a board of directors, each a carefully constructed fiction. He spent hours on stock photo websites, not just picking faces but casting a play. There was Marcus Thorne, the grizzled, silver-haired chairman, a Yale man with a fictional history of hostile takeovers in the 90s. There was Evelyn Reed, the razor-sharp chief strategy officer, an MIT Sloan graduate whose bio was peppered with jargon about synergy and disruptive innovation. Each had a LinkedIn profile, a ghost in the machine with a network of other phantom professionals, all endorsing each other for skills they never had in industries that didn't exist. It was a digital Potemkin village and it was flawless. The portfolio section was a stroke of genius. It listed a dozen successful exits, startups that Odyssey Capital had supposedly nurtured and sold for astronomical sums. Companies with names like EtherGrid and Synapse Dynamics. Leo had backdated their existence, creating faint digital footprints across the web. A forgotten press release here, a mention in an obscure tech blog there. And then came the masterstroke, the planted articles. Leo had contacts, or rather, he knew how to exploit the vulnerabilities of the modern media landscape. He found freelance contributors on platforms like Forbes and TechCrunch, writers who were paid by the article and had little editorial oversight. For a few $100s in cryptocurrency, they would publish a pre-written piece. Soon glowing articles appeared, praising Odyssey Capital's uncanny ability to spot the next big thing. One was titled, "The Quiet Giant," How Odyssey Capital is redefining venture capital. Another. Meet Julian Croft, the investor who turns code into gold. Julian Croft. That was Leo's persona. His nom de guerre. He wasn't just my nephew anymore. In this operation, he was the ruthless, enigmatic visionary at the helm of Odyssey. He communicated only through encrypted emails. His language a clipped, brutally efficient prose that oozed authority. For the rare phone call, he used a voice modulator, a piece of software that deepened his voice, adding a gravelly, world-weary texture. He became a man who had no time for pleasantries, a man who saw the world as a chessboard and was already 10 moves ahead. He was everything Richard aspired to be and everything he feared. My role was subtler, a performance of a different kind. I had to become the woman Richard thought he had left behind. Frail, confused, a ghost in my own home. I rehearsed my part in the quiet hours of the night. I practiced letting my shoulders slump. I practiced letting my voice tremble slightly when I spoke. I had to be the oblivious wife, the woman who overheard a fragment of a conversation, a golden tip from a friend. The stage was set. I called Leo on my regular cell phone, knowing Richard sometimes checked my call logs. The name was saved as Anna B., a friend from my old book club. Leo, using his normal voice, played the part of Anna's husband in the background. "Oh, Juliana, you won't believe the day I've had," I said into the phone, my voice pitched with carefully modulated exhaustion as I sat in the living room, knowing Richard was in his study just down the hall. "Anna, it's just so much." On the other end, Leo gave a prearranged cough. That was my cue. "What's that, Anna?" "Oh, tell Bob I said hello," I said, my voice perking up slightly. "He did? On his tech fund? That's wonderful. What was the name of that firm again? The one he's so excited about? Odyssey Capital? Never heard of them. Are they new? Oh, I see. Very exclusive. Well, good for him. No, Richard handles all of our finances now. It's all a bit too much for my head these days, you know?" I let the sentence hang in the air. A perfect little worm on a perfect little hook. I ended the call a few minutes later with more vague pleasantries. I didn't have to do anything else. I had planted the seed. Now I just had to make sure he found the garden. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I used the family iPad. I normally read from my old, dog-eared paperbacks, a habit Richard had often mocked as archaic. I sat on the sofa, scrolling aimlessly through news sites for 10 minutes before I typed Odyssey Capital into the search bar. The sleek, formidable website filled the screen. I let it sit there for a moment, an open portal to my revenge. Then, feigning a yawn, I got up to make tea, leaving the iPad on the coffee table, its screen glowing, the website a silent siren's call. I watched him from the kitchen through the open doorway. It took him 15 minutes to notice it. He walked out of his study stretching, and his eyes fell on the glowing screen. I saw the flicker of curiosity, then dismissal. He probably thought I'd been looking at cruise packages, an Odyssey Cruise Line perhaps. But then he moved closer. He picked up the iPad. His posture changed. He straightened up, his head tilting. I could see the reflection of the website in his glasses. His eyes, which had for so long looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, now held a new light. It was a familiar gleam, one I hadn't seen directed at me in decades, but had seen 100 times when he was closing a deal. It was the raw, unadulterated glint of greed. He stood there for a long time, swiping, zooming in on the executive bios, his thumb tracing the names of the fictional companies in the portfolio. I turned back to the counter, my heart a steady, cold drum against my ribs. I heard his sharp intake of breath when he must have found the Forbes article. He was hooked. The predator was sniffing the bait. Over the next few days, the name Odyssey Capital began to subtly permeate our house. Richard would leave his laptop open to the site. He would take hushed phone calls with Chloe, and I could hear fragments through the door. Unbelievable returns. Off-market opportunities. This guy Croft is a legend. They saw it as a shortcut, a golden ticket. Why bother with the slow, messy work of building Chloe's ridiculous app, Elysian, when they could simply get an infusion of cash from a top-tier firm? They could get rich on an investment, and Richard could prove to his young new partner that he was still a titan of industry. A week later, I saw the email in his sent folder. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was that confident in my irrelevance. It was a formal submission, a pitch deck for Elysian sent to the encrypted contact address on the Odyssey website. The business plan was even more laughable than I had imagined. It was a mess of buzzwords and stock photos of millennials laughing with salads. The financial projections were pure fantasy, promising exponential growth based on zero evidence. It was the kind of proposal a seasoned investor would delete in seconds. But Julian Croft was not a seasoned investor. He was a puppet and I was pulling the strings. 2 days later, the response came. Leo had crafted it perfectly. It arrived at 2 a.m., the time a busy, globe-trotting investor might finally get to his inbox. Mr. Hayes. It began, devoid of any warm greeting. I've reviewed the prospectus for Elysian. The concept is derivative and the market is saturated. Your projections are optimistic. I could imagine Richard's heart sinking as he read those lines, his ego taking a direct hit. But then came the pivot, the masterstroke of manipulation. However, the email continued, that is not what I invest in. I invest in people. And what the proposal fails to capture, but what my due diligence has revealed, is the operator behind it. You, Mr. Hayes. Your track record in real estate shows a pattern of aggressive and decisive action. You are a savvy operator who understands leverage. That is a rare commodity. The app is irrelevant. A man with your instincts could sell ice in a blizzard. I'm interested in the man, not the model. It was perfect. Leo had stroked Richard's ego in the one place it was most vulnerable. He had dismissed Chloe's idea as trivial while elevating Richard to the status of a misunderstood genius. He was validating the very narrative Richard had been telling himself for years, that he was the visionary, the deal-maker, and I was just the dead weight he was finally cutting loose. From that moment on, the negotiations were a masterclass in psychological warfare, orchestrated by Leo from his basement command center. He became a ghost in Richard's life, a voice on a secure line, an email in the dead of night. He dangled the prize, a multi-million-dollar valuation for Elysian, a number so absurdly high it would make Richard and Chloe royalty in their little world of influencers and wannabes. He sent them NDAs filled with complex legal jargon that made the deal feel momentous and real. He made them feel like they were being invited into an exclusive club. Richard was a man transformed. He walked around the house with a swagger I hadn't seen in years. He was condescending, but now his condescension was tinged with a smug pity. He saw me as a relic from a past he was about to gloriously transcend. He and Chloe were a team, whispering excitedly in corners, their faces illuminated by their phones as they planned their new life, a life funded by Julian Croft. Finally, after 2 weeks of this carefully choreographed dance, Leo prepared the final act. It was time to set the jaws of the trap. The final email came on a Tuesday morning. I knew it was coming. I was in the garden trimming the roses, my hands steady, the sun warm on my back. I felt a profound, chilling calm. I saw Richard read it through the living room window. He was standing by his desk, phone in hand. He read it once. Then a second time. He began to pace, a caged animal. He ran a hand through his hair, then walked to the window and stared out at me. But his eyes weren't seeing me. They were seeing a future, a choice. Later that day, when he was out, I read the email myself. Richard. It began, the use of his first name, a calculated shift towards a feigned partnership. We are impressed. Your hunger is palpable. Odyssey Capital is prepared to offer a second-round seed investment of $15 million for a 40% stake in Elysian Ventures. This valuation is contingent on one final condition: a test of commitment. Leo let that phrase hang there. A piece of corporate poetry designed to appeal to a man's pride. We do not partner with hobbyists, the email continued. We partner with warriors. We need to know that you are all in, that you have as much skin in the game as we do. Before we wire our funds, we require our partners to demonstrate their complete and total commitment. To qualify for Odyssey's matching funds, you and Ms. Summers must liquidate your entire asset pool. Every stock, every bond, every piece of real estate, every dollar. This must be consolidated into a single lump sum and wired into a neutral third-party escrow account. The transfer must be a single transaction. We need to see that you are willing to burn the boats to go all in on this new future. Once our system verifies the deposit, our matching funds will be released within the hour. It was audacious. It was insane. It was a demand so outrageous that any rational person would see it as the giant screaming red flag it was. But Richard was no longer a rational person. He was a man blinded by ego, high on the validation of a phantom billionaire. To him, this wasn't a red flag. It was a challenge. It was a gauntlet thrown down by Julian Croft, a test from one titan to another. And his pride, his cavernous fragile pride, would never ever let him back down from a challenge. He couldn't bear the thought of Julian Croft thinking he was a small man, a man afraid to take a risk. That night the house was tense. He and Chloe had a long, heated argument. I could hear their muffled voices from my bedroom. Chloe was scared. She had a shred of common sense left. "It's everything, Richard. Everything." I heard her cry. But I could also hear his response, his voice low and firm, filled with the self-assured bluster of a man who has already convinced himself. "It's a test, Chloe. This is how these guys operate. They want to see if we have the guts. If we back down now, we lose everything. This is our one shot." He wasn't just convincing her. He was convincing himself. He was drowning out the tiny panicked voice in his own head that was telling him something was wrong. By morning he had won. Silence descended on the house. It was the silence of a decision made. The silence of a fly, buzzing confidently towards the spider's web. The silence before the fall. The transfer wasn't a single clean slice. It was a methodical exsanguination, a digital bleeding out of 40 years, one transaction at a time. I watched it from the worn oak of my kitchen table, the same table where we'd signed the mortgage for this house, where our children had done their homework, where I had balanced the checkbooks that funded the life he was now dismantling. My laptop screen was the only source of light in the pre-dawn gloom, its clinical blue glow reflecting in the cold, black coffee I hadn't touched. The numbers on the screen began their slow, sickening descent. $1,212,451.18. That wasn't just money. That was the blistering summer I'd spent working 2 jobs so he could finish his degree. It was the inheritance from my father, invested with a skill Richard never bothered to understand. It was the vacations we'd planned but never took, the renovations I dreamed of for this very kitchen, the secure and quiet future I had been promised. With every flicker of the cursor, another piece of my life was carved away. $950,000. There went the down payment on the lake house we were supposed to retire in. $700,000, that was our daughter's wedding. The one he'd complained about the cost of even as he beamed for the cameras. $500,000. The emergency fund I'd built, the one he called my paranoid little stash. Now it was just fuel for his midlife crisis. A down payment on a younger, blonder, more pliable version of a wife. I felt a strange, detached calm settle over me. There were no tears. The time for tears had passed months ago, in the dead of night, muffled into my pillow so as not to disturb the man sleeping beside me, the man who was already living in another world. This was something else. This was the quiet focus of a predator watching its prey walk a little further into the snare. Leo, my brilliant nephew, my architect, had assured me everything was in place. "The cage is built, Aunt Juliana," he'd said, his voice a steady hum of confidence over the phone. "All he has to do is walk in and close the door behind him." And he was walking. Oh, he was practically sprinting. I could picture him now, sitting in her apartment, the one I'd seen in the background of her nauseatingly cheerful social media posts. It was all white leather and chrome. A sterile showroom for a life with no history. He'd be feeling powerful, virile. A master of the universe shedding his old, dull life like a snake shedding its skin. He probably thought of me, if he thought of me at all, as a relic. A sad little woman puttering around her garden, too naive to understand the complexities of the world he inhabited. The world I had built for him. He had forgotten who I was. That was his first and most fatal mistake. The balance hit $250,000. I remembered the day it had first crossed that threshold. Richard had bought a bottle of cheap champagne, the kind he would turn his nose up at now, and we'd toasted to being real adults. He'd kissed me, his eyes full of what I had mistaken for love, but now understood was simply satisfaction in his own perceived success. He saw me as a mirror, something to reflect his own glory back at him. But mirrors, he'd forgotten, can also show you the truth. The final transfer was the largest. A lump sum that wiped the slate clean. The account balance blinked. A series of mocking zeros taking the place of our shared history. $0. It was done. 40 years reduced to nothing in less than 10 minutes. My phone, resting on the table beside the laptop, buzzed. A single text message. From Richard. I picked it up, my hand steady. It's done, Juliana. This is for the best. I've left you the house, it's paid for. You'll be comfortable. Be well. Be well. The condescension was breathtaking. The casual cruelty of a man swatting a fly. He hadn't even had the courage to say my name in a real voice. He'd ended our life together with the same emotional investment one might use to cancel a magazine subscription. I didn't reply. I simply set the phone down, the screen glowing with his final pathetic dismissal. He thought he was leaving me with a house, an empty shell filled with memories he had tainted. He thought he was being generous. He had no idea he had just handed me the keys to my own liberation. A few minutes later, as the first gray light of morning began to creep through the kitchen window, my phone chimed with a different notification. An Instagram update. I tapped it open. It was from Chloe. A new story. The video burst onto my screen with jarring vibrancy, the sound of a champagne cork popping, followed by her high-pitched artificial shriek of delight. The camera swung around wildly before settling on her face, flushed and beaming, her lips a glossy, pouty pink. She held a flute of bubbling champagne. Richard was beside her, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. He looked older in the harsh light of her phone, tired and foolish, but he was smiling a broad, triumphant smile. She leaned in and planted a loud, wet kiss on his cheek, leaving a smear of lipstick. The camera panned down to the bottle. Dom Perignon, of course. Then it swung back to their faces as they clinked their glasses together. And then the caption appeared, typed out in a looping, girly font across the bottom of the screen. To new beginnings and leaving the past behind. Unstoppable power couple futures bright by Felicia. They were toasting. Toasting the theft of my life, my security, my past. Toasting their own brilliance. They were so sure of their victory. So wrapped up in their cheap, glittering fantasy. They felt unstoppable. I watched the short video loop 3 times. The pop of the cork. The stupid kiss. The clink of the glasses. A cold, hard smile touched my own lips for the first time that morning. They weren't toasting their victory. They were toasting their own demise. And I was about to deliver the eulogy. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, plunging the kitchen back into shadow. I stood up, my movements deliberate, unhurried. I rinsed my coffee mug in the sink, placed it carefully in the dish rack to dry. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled on my coat, the familiar weight of it a comfort. I picked up my car keys from the small dish by the door. I didn't need my purse. All I needed was in the single manila envelope resting on the passenger seat of my car. The drive across town was surreal. The world was waking up around me. People heading to work, school buses making their slow, rumbling stops, the city coming to life with its ordinary, everyday rhythm. It felt like watching a movie of a world I no longer belonged to. My world had narrowed to a single sharp point. A luxury high-rise apartment in a part of town I rarely visited. A sterile glass and steel tower where my husband was celebrating his new life. I didn't have to bribe a doorman or sneak past security. Richard, in his arrogance, had probably added her to every list, eager to show off his new acquisition. The lobby was just as I'd imagined it from her photos, cold, impersonal, and ostentatiously modern. It smelled of money and air freshener. I rode the silent, high-speed elevator up 27 floors, my reflection in the polished chrome walls looking back at me. A stranger with my own face. My expression was serene. My heart was a steady rhythmic drum. This wasn't about rage or revenge. It was about balance. It was an audit. A correction of the books. I found her apartment 27B, at the end of a long white hallway. I had expected to have to knock, to prepare a line, to face some sort of confrontation at the door. I didn't have to. The door was ajar. I could hear them from the hallway. The celebration was over. Her voice was the first thing I heard. It was no longer the bubbly, delighted squeal from her video. It was a shrill, grating thing laced with panic and fury. What do you mean it's not working? Richard, what did you do? You said this guy was legit. You said this was a sure thing. I pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. The chaos hit me like a physical force. The apartment was a disaster. Champagne glasses lay on their sides on the marble coffee table. Puddles of expensive alcohol soaking into a pristine white rug. A half-eaten tray of pastries was overturned on the floor. And in the middle of it all stood Chloe, her perfect makeup now smudged, her hair a mess. She was dressed in a silk robe, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at Richard's chest. Richard was a ghost. He sat hunched over a laptop on the white leather sofa, his face the color of ash. The triumphant titan from the Instagram story was gone, replaced by a pale, sweating old man, frantically clicking and reclicking his mouse. The frantic, repetitive click-click-click was the only sound he made. They didn't see me. They were too consumed by their own implosion. I don't understand, Richard was muttering, his voice thin and reedy. It was here. The portal was right here. It's gone. Gone? What do you mean gone? Chloe shrieked. $3 million doesn't just go gone, Richard. My app. My funding. Everything. You told me to put my money in too. You promised. The site won't load, he stammered, his eyes glued to the screen. It's an error message. 404 not found. Maybe their server is down. It has to be. I watched them for a long silent moment. I watched the man I had spent my life with crumble. I watched the woman he had chosen over me reveal her true colors, her concern not for him, but for the money he represented. It was exactly as I had pictured. No, it was better. I walked forward. My sensible flat shoes made no sound on her plush rug. I didn't say a word. I simply reached the coffee table, a sleek, low slab of marble between them, and placed the single sheet of paper from my envelope onto its surface. It landed with a soft, definitive whisper. The movement finally broke their frantic bubble of panic. Chloe stopped shouting. Richard stopped clicking. They both turned to look at me, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion. For a second, I don't think Richard even recognized me. I was so far out of the context of his new life, it was like his brain couldn't process my presence in this sterile white room. Juliana, he finally breathed, his voice barely audible. What are you doing here? I didn't answer him. I simply tilted my head, my eyes flicking down to the piece of paper on the table. Chloe, ever impatient, snatched it up first. What is this? She demanded, her eyes scanning the page. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows furrowed in confusion. It's just a bunch of numbers. A crypto transaction? What the hell is this? Richard took it from her trembling hand. His eyes, the eyes of a man who had spent his life reading financial statements, moved over the page. I watched his face as he processed the information. I saw the flicker of professional curiosity, the attempt to understand the data. I saw him trace the long alphanumeric string of the sending wallet, the holding account he and Leo had so carefully set up. Then I saw his eyes move to the destination wallet. It wasn't a random string of characters. It was a name. I had asked Leo if it was possible. He had laughed. For you, Aunt Juliana? Anything is possible. Richard read it. His lips moved, forming the words silently. His face, already pale, went completely bloodless. He looked down at the paper again, as if convinced he was hallucinating, that the words would change. They didn't. They remained there, printed in stark, irrefutable black ink. The Juliana Hayes Liberation Fund. Time seemed to stop. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city 27 floors below. Chloe was still looking at him, waiting for an explanation, but Richard was no longer in the room with her. He was somewhere else, a place of pure, cold, dawning horror. Slowly, as if it took a monumental effort, he lifted his head. His eyes, wide and glassy, finally met mine. The arrogance was gone. The condescension was gone. All that was left was the raw, shattering recognition of a man who has just realized he has been checkmated in a game he didn't even know he was playing. The hunter, staring at the steel teeth of the trap that had just snapped shut around his leg. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He tried again, a dry, rasping noise catching in his throat. Finally, he managed to choke out a single word, a question that was also a confession of his own utter ruin. You. The man I had spent 40 years with did not just break. He imploded. It was not a gradual crumbling, but a catastrophic failure of the entire structure he had built around himself. The confident posture, the one he used to command boardrooms and charm investors, vanished. His shoulders slumped, his spine curved, and the expensive Italian suit he wore suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. A costume hanging on a broken puppet. His face, usually a mask of calculated authority, collapsed into a mess of sagging flesh and red-rimmed eyes. He stared at the statement in my hand, then at my face, and a sound escaped him. It was a low, guttural noise, the sound of an animal realizing the trap has sprung. He fell to his knees. It was so sudden, so theatrical, that for a moment I thought it was another performance. But the tears were real, thick and ugly, carving paths through the artificial tan on his cheeks. Jules, he sobbed, the nickname a rusty key to a lock that no longer existed. He crawled forward, reaching for the hem of my coat. I took a deliberate step back, the fabric pulling away from his grasp. The small movement seemed to wound him more than a shout would have. Jules, please, he begged, his voice a choked, pathetic whine. I made a mistake. Terrible mistake. We can fix this. I can fix this. I'll get it all back. I swear. He was promising to fix a life he had systematically dismantled. He was promising to return money he never believed I was smart enough to control. The words were hollow, echoes in an empty chamber. I watched him, this man who had called me slow, who had patronized me in front of our friends, who had planned to leave me with nothing but memories and a paid-off mortgage, and I felt a profound and unsettling calm. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't glee. It was the quiet relief of a diagnosis confirmed, the placid stillness after a long destructive storm has finally passed. He tried to blame her, of course. A coward's last resort. He scrambled to his feet and pointed a trembling finger at Chloe, who stood frozen by the floor-to-ceiling window, her own face a mask of horrified disbelief. It was her. Richard shrieked, his voice cracking into a pubescent squeal. This whole Elysian thing, it was her idea. She pushed me, Jules. She told me you wouldn't understand, that you were out of touch. She wanted the money. All of it. The sound of the slap was like a gunshot in the pristine white apartment. It was sharp, clean, and vicious. Chloe's hand, adorned with the gaudy ring he'd bought her, left a bright red imprint on his cheek. Her fantasy of a life funded by my life's work had just evaporated, and the beautiful, curated influencer was replaced by a cornered, furious woman. You pathetic old man, she spat, her voice laced with venom. You told me she was a simple housewife. You told me you had it all under control. You swore to me that you were the genius, the one who built everything. She let out a laugh that was more like a sob. My God, you weren't even the architect of your own life. She was. She looked at me then, not with hatred, but with a flicker of something that might have been grudging respect, before it was consumed again by her own panic. Richard stumbled back from the force of her blow, holding his face, looking between the two of us like a lost child seeking a parent to quell the nightmare. His eyes landed on me again, filled with a desperate final plea. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer another lie, another promise, another bargain. I raised a hand not to strike him, but to simply signal an end. The silence that fell was immediate and absolute. I let it hang in the air, thick and heavy with the dust of their shattered future. I looked at the wreckage of the man I had once loved, the man who had shared my bed and my life, who had fathered my children. And I felt nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just the quiet finality of a closed book. "You didn't want a partner, Richard," I said, and my voice was perfectly steady, as clear and cold as the glass of water I'd had that morning. "You wanted an audience. Someone to applaud your successes and quietly absorb your failures. You wanted a spectator for the grand performance of your life." I paused, letting the words settle into him. "The show is over." I turned without another word and walked toward the door. I didn't rush. My footsteps were measured and even on the polished hardwood floor. Behind me I heard the beginning of a new sound, the ugly, shrill symphony of their mutual ruin as they turned on each other, accusations and insults flying like shrapnel. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. As I pulled the heavy apartment door closed, the cacophony was cut off, leaving only the gentle click of the latch. The silence in the hallway was a blessing. Taped neatly to their door, right at eye level, was a crisp, official-looking envelope. The notice of impending foreclosure on the second mortgage. The one Richard had taken out by forging my signature. It was a small, perfect piece of punctuation to a story that was now finally complete. I allowed myself a small, tight smile. Not of malice but of neatness. Of accounts settled. The drive to the airport was surreal. The city, which had felt like a cage for so many years, now seemed vibrant and full of life. I saw it all with new eyes. The rush of traffic, the anonymous faces on the sidewalk, the skyscrapers reaching for a limitless sky. I was just another anonymous face now, and the feeling was not lonely but liberating. I walked into the international terminal at Denver International, pulling a single sleek carry-on behind me. The vast, vaulted space hummed with the energy of 1,000 different journeys. The low rumble of rolling suitcases, the melodic chime of a PA announcement in a language I didn't recognize, the scent of coffee and jet fuel. It was the smell of beginnings. I found a seat near the grand windows overlooking the tarmac, watching planes ascend into the pale blue sky, each one a silver promise of somewhere else. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw Leo's name on the screen. My architect. My partner in this quiet rebellion. I smiled. The text was short, efficient, just like him. "Foreclosure papers served. They know it's over. Where to next, Aunt J?" I looked up from the small screen to the massive departure board that dominated the wall. The names of cities scrolled past in a hypnotic, endlessly promising cascade. London, Paris, Tokyo, Rome, Buenos Aires, Sydney. Each name was a potential life, a story yet to be written. For 40 years my world had been a single address, a single role. Now the world was an open itinerary. A genuine smile spread across my face. It felt unfamiliar, like stretching a muscle I hadn't used in decades. It was light. It was real. I felt the last 40 years slew off me like a heavy coat I had finally been allowed to set down. I was no longer Juliana Hayes, the forgotten wife. I was just Juliana. I looked down at my phone, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I thought about the man and the woman I'd left behind, trapped in their glass box with their ugly truths and their mounting debts. I thought about the house that was no longer mine, and the life that had never really been mine to begin with. And then I let it all go. I typed my reply to Leo, a simple sentence that held the weight of my entire future. Somewhere warm and free.